The rifle's crack split the midnight air like thunder. Ezekiel Hartwell dove behind the overturned wagon just as splinters of wood exploded where his head had been. His chest heaved against the cold earth of the town square, blood seeping through his torn shirt from the bullet that had grazed his shoulder. Above him, oil lamps flickered in the windows of Millbrook's finest houses, their occupants no doubt cowering behind drawn curtains, pretending they couldn't hear the gunshots that would decide his fate. "Come out, you yellow-bellied dog, Judge." Cornelius Whitmore's voice boomed across the empty square, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones as he reloaded. "Face your judgment like a man." Ezekiel pressed his back harder against the wagon wheel, his calloused fingers gripping the handle of his hunting knife, the only weapon he had against the judge's Winchester. 3 months ago, he'd been Whitmore's most trusted tracker, the man who could follow any trail through the dense Ohio forests, who never failed to bring back his quarry. The judge had called him his faithful hound, praised him before the town council, even invited him to sit at the servants' table during harvest celebrations. That was before Evangeline. The memory of her cornflower blue eyes and honey-colored hair twisted in his gut like a blade. Before that cursed night when she'd slipped from her father's mansion to meet him by Miller's Creek, when she'd pressed her lips to his in the moonlight and whispered that she didn't care about the difference in their stations. Before her father had discovered them in each other's arms, her white nightgown stained with creek water and passion, his rough hands tangled in her silken hair. "I know you're there, Hartwell." Another shot rang out, this one closer. "You think you can defile my daughter and run? Think you can make a fool of Judge Whitmore?" Ezekiel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his past bearing down like a millstone. Born in the shanties by the railroad tracks, raised by a mother who took in washing and a father who drank away his wages, he'd clawed his way to respectability through skill with rifle and rope. For 10 years, he'd served the judge faithfully, tracking runaway slaves back to their masters, hunting down horse thieves and claim jumpers. He'd told himself it was honest work that a man had to eat. But love had made him see the bars of his own cage. "Ezekiel." The soft whisper came from the shadows beside the general store. His heart nearly stopped as Evangeline stepped into the moonlight, her dark cloak unable to hide the determination blazing in her eyes. "Father's men are surrounding the square. There's a horse waiting behind the church. We can make it to the river before dawn." He shook his head violently. "Go back, Evangeline. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I chose you." Her voice carried the steel he'd always admired, the fire that burned beneath her ladylike exterior. "I won't let him destroy us." Another shot shattered the night, and this time Judge Whitmore's cruel laughter followed. "I see you both now. Come morning, this town will know what happens to those who forget their place." That night would indeed change everything. Dawn painted the sky blood red as their stolen horse thundered across the frost-covered meadow, Evangeline's arms wrapped tight around Ezekiel's waist. "Ack!" Her father's hunting party closing the distance. With each passing mile, as the thunder of hooves behind them grew louder, punctuated by the occasional crack of rifle fire that sent birds scattering from the bare November trees. "The bridge is out ahead," Evangeline shouted over the wind, her voice barely audible above the pounding hooves. Storm last month washed it clean away. Ezekiel's jaw tightened as he spotted the gap where Carpenter's Bridge once stood, the swollen creek rushing 20 feet below through jagged rocks that could shatter a man's bones like kindling. Behind them, Judge Whitmore's voice carried across the field like a death knell. "Surrender now, and I'll make it quick." "Hold tight," Ezekiel growled, spurring their mount toward the ravine's edge. The horse launched itself into empty air, Evangeline's scream lost in the rush of wind. For a heartbeat that lasted eternity, they flew to souls defying gravity and social order alike, before crashing hard into the muddy bank on the far side. Ezekiel rolled, pulling Evangeline clear as their horse stumbled and regained its footing. Flanks heaving, the hunting party reined up at the ravine's edge, Judge Whitmore's face purple with rage. "You can't run forever, Hartwell. I own every sheriff from here to the Mississippi. Every marshal, every constable, they all know what you've done, what I've done." Ezekiel stood slowly, his arm still around Evangeline's trembling shoulders. "I loved your daughter, Whitmore. That's my only crime. You corrupted her." The judge's voice cracked like a whip. "Turned my pure angel into a common whore with your dirty hands and your lies." Evangeline stepped forward, chin raised in defiance despite the mud staining her traveling dress. No one corrupted me, Father. I chose this. I chose him. You don't know what you're saying, child? Judge Whitmore's tone turned pleading. He's bewitched you, filled your head with romantic nonsense. Come home and we'll forget this madness. I'll find you a proper husband. Young Pemberton's boy has been asking. I'd rather die than marry that pompous fool. Evangeline's voice rang clear across the water. You raised me to think for myself, Father. Did you think I'd never use that gift to choose my own heart? The judge's face hardened again. Then you've chosen damnation, both of you, as if summoned by his words. More riders appeared on the ridge. Deputy Marshal Collins with his federal badge, Sheriff Brennan with his scarred face and reputation for brutality, and behind them a dozen bounty hunters with ropes already fashioned into nooses. Federal warrant for kidnapping, Collins called out, his voice carrying official authority. Worth $500 alive, $1,000 if he's breathing when we string him up. Evangeline gasped. Kidnapping? But I came willingly, your testimony. Won't matter in my courtroom, Judge Whitmore said coldly. But against sworn statements from a dozen upstanding citizens who saw him drag you from your bed. Ezekiel's hand found the Navy Colt tucked beneath his coat, stolen from the judge's own gun cabinet during their escape. 6 shots against 14 men with Evangeline caught in the crossfire. The mathematics of survival had never looked grimmer. But as he watched the bounty hunters unfurl their ropes, saw the hungry gleam in their eyes as they calculated their payday, Ezekiel felt something wild and desperate unfurl in his chest. Love had made him an outlaw. It would make him something far more dangerous. Can you swim? He whispered to Evangeline. Like a fish, she whispered back. Why? His answer was drowned by gunfire as the first bounty hunter spurred his horse toward the water. The icy creek water closed over their heads like a baptism into outlawry, bullets slicing through the current above them as Judge Whitmore's men peppered the surface with lead. Ezekiel's lungs burned as he pulled Evangeline downstream. Using the rocky bottom and overhanging willows for cover, her sodden skirts threatening to drag them both under, they surfaced a quarter-mile downstream, gasping and shivering behind fallen oak that had created a natural dam. Evangeline's lips were blue with cold, her honey hair plastered to her skull, but her eyes still blazed with determination. The old Quaker settlement, she whispered, teeth chattering. 3 miles south. Through the woods? They won't turn us away. Ezekiel nodded, though he knew better. The Society of Friends might offer sanctuary to runaway slaves. But harboring a kidnapper, even a false one, would bring federal marshals down on their peaceful community like wolves. Still, it was their only chance. They crawled from the creek. As the sun climbed higher, their wet clothes steaming in the autumn air, behind them, they could hear Whitmore's men spreading out along the banks, their shouts echoing through the forest as they searched for tracks. This way, Evangeline led them deeper into the woods, her bare feet silent on the carpet of fallen leaves. Growing up in these hills, she'd spent countless hours exploring while her governess thought she was practicing embroidery. Now that rebellious streak might save their lives. But as they crested a ridge overlooking the Quaker settlement, Ezekiel's heart sank. Federal cavalry surrounded the simple wooden buildings, their blue uniforms stark against the peaceful farmland. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the meeting house, where families were no doubt being questioned about harboring fugitives. Dear God, Evangeline breathed. He's turned the whole territory against us. A twig snapped behind them, and they spun to find a grizzled mountain man emerging from behind a massive pine, his long rifle trained on Ezekiel's chest. Buckskin clothes marked him as one of the old-timers who'd lived in these hills since before. The first settlers, when this land belonged to the Delaware and Shawnee. Well, the stranger drawled, tobacco juice staining his gray beard. If it ain't the famous lovers everyone's jawing about, Josiah Pike's the name, and that's one hell of a bounty on your head, boy. Ezekiel stepped protectively in front of Evangeline, his hand inching toward his concealed pistol. How much is Whitmore paying you, Pike? The mountain man's weathered face creased into what might have been a grin. Nothing, son. See, I got no love for judges and their kind. Been living free in these mountains for 30 years, ever since I deserted from the army, rather than shoot down Sioux women and children. Hope flickered in Ezekiel's chest. You're not here for the bounty? Hell no. Pike spat into the leaves. I'm here 'cause word's spreading through the hills about what you've done. Some folks are calling you a fool, but others. He gestured toward the settlement below. Others are saying it's about time somebody stood up to the high and mighty. As if to prove his point, a group of men emerged from the forest farmers and trappers by their clothes, but carrying rifles with the easy familiarity of veterans. Among them, Ezekiel recognized faces from town, the blacksmith whose forge Whitmore had tried to close for supporting abolition, the newspaper editor who'd been threatened for printing unflattering articles about the judge's business dealings. Your little rebellion's got some folks thinking, Pike continued. Thinking maybe it's time to remind certain powerful men that this is still America, where a man's worth ain't measured by the size of his bank account. The blacksmith of a man named Ulysses Crane, stepped forward. We heard what really happened, Ezekiel. How you and Miss Evangeline been courting proper for months, meeting by the creek all secret like. How her father flew into a rage when he caught you together, started telling lies about kidnapping and worse. The judge owns the sheriff, the marshal, half the county, another man added. But he don't own us. Not yet. Evangeline moved to Ezekiel's side, her cold hand finding his. You'd risk everything for strangers? Pike's grin widened. Ain't about strangers, miss. It's about principle. Your daddy thinks he can hunt decent folk like animals. Well, maybe it's time he learned what it feels like to be the prey. Abandon. Copper mine tunneled deep into Copper Ridge like a wound in the earth, its entrance hidden by 20 years of overgrowth and carefully placed deadfall. Here, in chambers that once echoed with pickaxes and dynamite, a different kind of rebellion was taking root. By lantern light, Ulysses Crane spread hand-drawn maps across a makeshift table while Pike cleaned his rifle and Evangeline helped tend the wounds of 3 more men who'd arrived since dawn, farmers who'd lost their land to Whitmore's bank, a shopkeeper whose store had been mysteriously burned after he'd refused to extend the judge credit. 27 men now, Crane reported, his massive blacksmith's hand surprisingly gentle as he marked positions on the map. More coming in every hour. Word spreading that somebody's finally standing up to his honor. Ezekiel studied the crude drawings of Millbrook streets, noting the positions of the courthouse, the bank, the sheriff's office, all owned or controlled by Judge Whitmore, all fortresses in his private kingdom. This isn't what I wanted, he said quietly. People getting hurt because of my choices? Your choices? An old German immigrant named Friedrich Weber looked up from sharpening his hunting knife. Main friend, your judge has been crushing this valley for 10 years. You just gave us excuse to fight back. Others nodded grimly. Stories poured out in the flickering lamplight for closed farms, trumped up charges. Young men pressed into service as deputy marshals or driven from their homes. Judge Whitmore hadn't just been building wealth, he'd been building an empire, one broken family at a time. My father wasn't always like this, Evangeline said softly, her voice carrying in the cavern's depths. She sat on a rough blanket, her fine dress replaced by borrowed work clothes that somehow made her seem more beautiful, more real. When Mother was alive, he was ... gentler. But after the fever took her, something died in him too. She looked up at Ezekiel with eyes that held depths of sorrow. He used to tell me stories about falling in love with a poor minister's daughter, how her family opposed the match. But he fought for her, defied them all. I thought he'd understand. Pike worked tobacco into his cheek, his expression thoughtful. Power changes men, miss. Makes them forget where they come from, start thinking they're somehow better than the folks they climbed over. A commotion at the mine entrance interrupted him. Young Billy Hutchins, barely 16 and eager to prove himself, stumbled into the lamplight with news that made everyone reach for their weapons. They got the preacher, Billy gasped. Reverend Matthews from the Methodist Church. Sheriff Brennan arrested him this morning, charged with harboring fugitives. They say he helped you escape, gave you money and supplies. Evangeline's face went white. But he's innocent. We never even spoke to him. Don't matter, Crane growled. Whitmore's sending a message. Anyone who might help you. Anyone who might speak against him. They're all targets now. Friedrich Weber stood slowly, his weathered face grim. In the old country, we had name for this. Schrecked. shuffed shrill by terror. First, they come, for one, then another, until no one dares speak. Not here, Pike said firmly, not in America. But even as the mountain man spoke those words, more reports filtered in. The schoolteacher dismissed for refusing to condemn the criminals. The doctor threatened with losing his license for treating one of their wounded supporters. Judge Whitmore was tightening his grip like a noose, squeezing the life from anyone who might oppose him. Ezekiel felt the weight of responsibility, settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Every man in this cavern, every family suffering. Whitmore's revenge had all traced back to that moment by Miller's Creek, when he dared to touch a judge's daughter with his calloused hands. There's something else, Billy added reluctantly. Talk in town as the judges sent for help. Federal troops from Fort McPherson, professional bounty hunters from as far as Kansas City. They're saying he's offering $10,000 for your head, Ezekiel, dead or alive. Some drew whistles and curses from the assembled men. $10,000 more money than most of them would see in a lifetime. So what's it to be? Pike asked, his eyes meeting each man in turn. We can scatter. To the winds, hope Whitmore is satisfied with driving us off. We can make a stand. Evangeline stood slowly, her chin raised in the gesture Ezekiel had come to love. If we run, he wins. If we hide, he wins. But if we fight, people die, Ezekiel finished grimly. Good people, with families and dreams. Good people are already dying, Crane pointed out. Question is whether we die on our knees or on our feet. The mountain man Pike checked his rifle's action one final time, the click of the mechanism echoing in the cavern like a judge's gavel. Reckon it's time to remind his honor that even hunting dogs got teeth. The attack came at dawn, swift and merciless as a winter storm. Federal cavalry thundered up the ridge toward the mine entrance while professional bounty hunters flanked through the forest, their Spencer repeating rifles crackling in the morning mist. Judge Whitmore had found their hideout. Move, everyone. Out the back tunnel? Pike roared, his voice barely audible over the gunfire erupting outside. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls as the defenders grabbed what weapons they could. 27 men suddenly transformed from idealistic rebels into desperate fugitives. Ezekiel pressed the Navy Colt into Evangeline's hands, his fingers covering hers as he showed her how to cock the hammer. Stay behind me, keep low, and if something happens, nothing's going to happen. Her voice held steel, but he could feel her trembling. We're getting out of this together. The rear tunnel emerged halfway down the ridge, concealed by a thicket of mountain laurel that Pike had cultivated for exactly this purpose. But as they crawled from the earth like moles, Ezekiel's heart sank. Blue uniforms waited among the trees. The Federals had anticipated their escape route. Surrender now and we'll make it easy. Captain Morrison called out, his cavalry saber catching the morning light. Keep running, and we'll hunt you down like rabbits. Pike spat tobacco juice and raised his long rifle. When I was a young fool in Mexico, I learned something about cavalry charges. They're real impressive, right up until they hit rough ground. The mountain man's shot took Morrison clean from his saddle, and suddenly the forest exploded into chaos. Men scattered in all directions, using every tree and boulder for cover as professional soldiers, tried to impose order on wilderness warfare they'd never trained for. Friedrich Weber's hunting knife flashed as he brought down a bounty hunter hood. Gotten too close? Billy Hutchins, barely old enough to shave, fought with the desperate fury of youth as he reloaded his father's old musket. These weren't soldiers, they were ordinary men pushed beyond endurance, fighting for something more precious than money or glory. The creek. Evangeline pointed toward the sound of rushing water. If we can reach the gorge, they can't follow on horseback. But between them and safety stretched 50 yards of open ground, swept by rifle fire from professional marksmen who knew their business. Already 3 of their number lay still among the fallen leaves, their blood seeping into soil that had never known such violence. Crane materialized beside them, his blacksmith's muscles barely slowed by a bullet graze along his ribs. Yikes. Got an idea, but it's crazy even for him. The mountain man emerged from behind a massive oak, his face streaked with powder smoke and grim determination. See that deadfall blocking the stream up yonder? Been meaning to clear it for years, but never got around to it. Ezekiel followed his gaze to where fallen trees had created a natural dam, backing up water into a substantial pond. Understanding dawned like sunrise. "You mean to dynamite from the old mining days?" Pike grinned fiercely. "Should make quite a flood when she goes. Question is, can you and the lady swim in fast water?" More gunfire erupted as federal reinforcements pushed up from the valley, their disciplined volleys cutting through the forest like scythes. Captain Morrison's replacement was directing his men with professional efficiency, setting up crossfire that would soon make their position untenable. "Do it," Ezekiel decided. "Whatever happens, we're not surrendering to Whitmore's justice." Mike nodded and began working his way upstream, moving through the underbrush with the silent skill of 3 decades in the wilderness. Behind them, they could hear orders being shouted as the Federals prepared for a final assault. Evangeline checked the pistols' chambers, her hands steady now despite everything. "My father used to say I was too stubborn for my own good." "Thank God for that," Ezekiel replied, pulling her close for what might be their last kiss. The explosion, when it came, shook the entire ridge. Ancient trees groaned and crashed as a wall of water burst from the broken dam, carrying logs and boulders in its churning embrace. Horses screamed and soldiers cursed as the flood swept through their positions, turning ordered battle lines into chaos. "Now," Pike's voice carried over the roar of water. While they're scattered, Ezekiel and Evangeline plunged into the torrent hand in hand, the icy current seizing them like a living thing. Behind them, the ridge erupted in confused gunfire as men shot at shadows and their own reflections. Professional discipline dissolved by the wilderness itself. They tumbled through white water and over stones, lungs burning, muscles screaming, but somehow still together. When they finally dragged themselves onto a sandbar 2 miles downstream, half drowned and battered, they weren't alone. Pike hauled himself from the water, his rifle somehow still intact. Friedrich Weber emerged coughing and sputtering, but alive. One by one, the survivors gathered, fewer than before, but unbroken. "Well," Pike wheezed, wringing water from his beard, "reckon we just declared ourselves official outlaws." But Ezekiel was looking downstream, toward the distant smoke of cities and the promise of lands where Judge Whitmore's writ didn't run. The game had changed again, and running was no longer retreat. It was strategy. 3 weeks later, the abandoned church stood like a broken prayer against the Iowa sky, its steeple long since collapsed and its congregation scattered to dust. But in its shadowed nave, lit by candles that flickered like hope in the darkness, 37 voices rose in a different kind of worship. "We gather tonight not as outlaws," Reverend Tobias Stern intoned, his collar exchanged for homespun and his parish replaced by men with prices on their heads, but as witnesses to a truth that no earthly judge can overturn. Evangeline stood beside Ezekiel before the improvised altar, her wedding dress sewn from white cotton by the wives of farmers and trappers. Her bouquet gathered from prairie wildflowers that asked no permission to bloom. She had never looked more beautiful than in this moment, surrounded by men who had chosen principle over profit, love over law. Pike served as witness, his usually gruff face softened by something approaching tenderness. Friedrich Weber had walked her down the aisle, her chosen father since her blood father had forsworn her. The other men formed a protective circle, weapons close at hand, knowing that even this sacred moment could be shattered by the thunder of federal hooves. "By what right do we perform this ceremony?" Reverend Stern continued, his voice carrying the weight of conviction earned through suffering. "By the same right that allowed our fathers to declare independence from kings, that allows any free soul to choose love over fear." Word had spread through the underground network of sympathizers and refugees, drawing support from unexpected quarters. Escaped slaves heading north had shared their roots in safe houses. Mormon families, themselves fleeing persecution, had provided supplies and intelligence. Even some federal soldiers, disgusted by orders to hunt lovers like criminals, had begun looking the other way or arriving at raided camps hours too late. But Judge Whitmore's reach was still long, his anger still burning. Reports filtered in daily, more arrests in Millbrook, more families driven from their homes, a reign of terror that had turned the once peaceful valley into an armed camp. The judge had declared martial law, claiming federal authority to hunt his daughter and her lover, across state lines. "Do you, Ezekiel Hartwell," the Reverend asked, "take this woman as your lawful wife, before God and these witnesses in defiance of all earthly powers that would keep you apart?" "I do," Ezekiel replied, his voice carrying across the broken church with absolute certainty. "And do you, Evangeline Whitmore? Forsake all claim to worldly comfort and social position, choosing instead the uncertain road of an outlaw's wife." Evangeline's voice rang clear as a bell. "Forsake nothing, Reverend. I gain everything." Turned to face Ezekiel, her eyes blazing with the same fire that had lit their first kiss by Miller's Creek. "I choose the man I love, whatever the cost." As Reverend Stern pronounced them man and wife, gunfire erupted in the distance. Not the random shots of hunters, but the disciplined volleys of cavalry. Someone had betrayed their location. "Move," Pike commanded, but his voice held no panic. They had prepared for this moment, planned for it, accepted it as inevitable. The church had 3 exits, the horses were saddled, and the men knew their roles. Ezekiel swept Evangeline into his arms, her wedding dress billowing as he carried her toward the rear door. Around them, their makeshift congregation transformed into a military unit with practiced efficiencies, some heading for the horses, others taking defensive positions, all moving with the deadly grace of men who had learned to live outside the law. "Wait," Evangeline commanded as they reached the threshold. She turned back toward the altar, toward the simple cross that had blessed their union. "Whatever happens next, remember this moment. Remember that loved one." Federal cavalry crested the hill like a blue tide, their sabers flashing in the afternoon sun. At their head rode Judge Whitmore himself, his face twisted with rage and righteousness, leading the hunt for his own daughter. But as the newlyweds mounted their horse and spurred toward the distant tree line, they weren't running in defeat. They were riding toward a different kind of victory, one measured not in battles won or enemies defeated, but in the simple, revolutionary act of choosing each other. Behind them, the church bells, silent for years, suddenly began to ring. Had rigged them with gunpowder, and as the building erupted in flames, the bronze voices sang out their defiance to the sky. The sound followed the fugitive wedding party across the prairie, a hymn of rebellion that no earthly power could silence. Judge Whitmore reined up before the burning church, his face illuminated by flames that consumed the last sanctuary his daughter had known. In that moment, watching his own legacy turn to ash and his own flesh and blood ride away with the man he'd branded a criminal, he began to understand what his pursuit had cost. But understanding came too late. The hunt would continue, because men like Whitmore couldn't bear to lose, especially to something as simple and dangerous as love. The wedding bells rang until the fire claimed them, their final notes echoing across the endless American sky. The letter arrived at dawn, delivered by a one-armed Confederate veteran who'd ridden through 3 states to find them. Ezekiel read it twice before his hands began to shake, the paper crackling in the cold mountain air where their band had made. "Winter camp? What is it?" Evangeline asked, setting aside the rifle she'd been cleaning, a skill learned during months of running that had transformed the judge's pampered daughter into something harder, more dangerous. "Your father," Ezekiel's voice was hollow, "dying." The consumption had taken hold fast, according to the letter from Dr. Aldrich, Judge Whitmore's own physician, writing in secret to the daughter who'd been declared legally dead in his court. Months of obsessive pursuit, sleeping rough in pursuit of fugitives, breathing the dust of a dozen trails had weakened lungs already compromised by years of cigars and rage. "He's calling off the hunt," Ezekiel continued, his eyes scanning the careful handwriting. "Federal warrants withdrawn, bounties rescinded. He wants... ... His voice caught. "He wants to see you before he dies." Around their mountain camp, 30 men waited in silence. It had grown from desperate fugitives into something approaching a folk legend, Hartwell's Raiders. Some called them the outlaw band that robbed from corrupt officials and shared their spoils with dispossessed farmers. They'd hit 3 of Whitmore's banks, liberated 2 jails full of political prisoners, and become symbols of resistance across 4 states. Friedrich Weber lowered his coffee cup, steam rising in the frigid air. Could be trap main friends. Man, he has lied before. Pike nodded grimly. Wouldn't put it past the old bastard to fake his own dying if it meant getting his hands on you. But Evangeline was studying her husband's face, reading the conflict written there in lines carved by months of outdoor living and constant vigilance. You think it's real? Dr. Aldridge delivered you when you were born, Ezekiel said quietly. He's never broken an oath in 40 years of practice. If he says your father is dying, he let the implications hang in the cold air. The decision split their band down the middle. Half wanted to ignore the summons entirely. Judge Whitmore had made his choice when he chose vengeance over family. The other half, led by Reverend Stern, argued that forgiveness was divine, that even sworn enemies deserve the chance for final reconciliation. Not about what he deserves, Evangeline said finally, her breath misting in the mountain air. It's about what I can live with. If he dies hating me, hating us, then his poison spreads to another generation. Ulysses Crane sharpened his knife against a whetstone, the rhythmic sound cutting through morning silence. If we go back fighting. No surrender, no matter what promises he makes on his deathbed. Agreed, Pike said. But we go careful. Send scouts ahead, have escape routes planned. Keep the main force in the hills ready to strike if it goes wrong. The journey back to Millbrook took a week, traveling by night through forests they knew better than any federal patrol, guided by a network of sympathizers who'd grown during their months as outlaws. The valley had changed in their absent scraps, rotted unharvested and fields abandoned by families driven away. Businesses shuttered. The very prosperity Judge Whitmore had built, crumbling without the people he'd oppressed. They approached the Whitmore mansion on a November evening when frost painted the world silver. A dozen men surrounding the house, while Ezekiel and Evangeline walked alone up the front steps she'd last descended as a fleeing daughter. The door opened before they could knock, revealing Mrs. Henderson, the elderly housekeeper who'd raised Evangeline after her mother's death. Her eyes filled with tears at the sight of her former charge, now lean and dangerous in buckskin and wool, a pistol on her hip and steel in her gaze. Miss Evangeline, the old woman whispered, "Oh, child, you've come home." But as they climbed the familiar stairs toward the judge's bedroom, Evangeline felt the weight of all the months between. This wasn't homecoming, it was closure. The final scene in a drama that had cost too much already. Judge Cornelius Whitmore lay propped against silk pillows, his once commanding frame wasted by disease and obsession. His eyes still sharp, despite his body's failing, fixed on his daughter with an expression that mixed love, rage, and something that might have been regret. So, he wheezed, his voice barely a shadow of its former thunder. The prodigal daughter returns. Evangeline pulled up a chair beside the bed, her hand finding Ezekiel's. "I came because you asked, Father. But I'm not here to beg forgiveness for loving a good man." The judge's laugh turned into a coughing fit that brought blood to his lips. When he could speak again, his words carried the weight of months spent facing his own mortality. "I destroyed everything trying to get you back," he admitted. "The valley, the people, my own legacy, all ashes now." Outside the window, the lights of Millbrook flickered like dying stars, a town emptied by one man's inability to accept that love didn't recognize the boundaries he'd tried to impose. Judge Whitmore's confession continued through the long night, each word drawn from him like blood from a stone. By lamplight, father and daughter sat across a chasm of hurt and understanding that seemed impossible to bridge, while Ezekiel kept watch at the window for signs of treachery that never came. "Your mother," the judge whispered, his eyes distant with memory. "Elizabeth always said I had too much pride for my own good. When you chose him, it wasn't you I was angry with, it was myself, remembering what I'd once been." Evangeline leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "What you'd been. Young, foolish, in love with a preacher's daughter whose father thought I wasn't good enough." His laugh dissolved into coughing. Sound familiar? The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Judge Whitmore had spent months hunting his daughter for repeating his own story, for choosing love over social convention exactly as he once had. "Elizabeth's father tried to have me arrested," the judge continued. "Trumped up charges, paid witnesses. The whole corrupt machinery turned against a poor law clerk who dared reach above his station. I swore then that when I had power, I'd never let anyone make me feel small again. So you became the thing you once fought, Ezekiel said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, just recognition of a familiar human tragedy. Worse. Whitmore's eyes met his son-in-law's without flinching. I became my own enemy, used the law the same way Elizabeth's father had used it against me. Power corrupted me so completely, I couldn't see I was destroying the very thing I claimed to protect. He reached toward a mahogany box on his bedside table, his trembling fingers working the brass clasp. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay a daguerreotype of a young woman with Evangeline's eyes and gentle smile. Your mother kept a diary, he said, producing a leather-bound book. I found it after she died, but I was too proud to read it, too afraid of what she might have written about the man I was becoming. His voice cracked. I finally read it last month, when the consumption started taking hold. Evangeline accepted the diary with reverent hands, her eyes already filling with tears at the sight of her mother's careful handwriting. She wrote about you, her father continued, about how proud she was that her daughter had inherited her courage, her willingness to follow her heart despite the consequences. She knew somehow that you'd choose love over comfort when the time came. The revelation hung in the air between them, transforming months of pain into something approaching understanding. Elizabeth Whitmore had seen her daughter's future and blessed it, even knowing the cost. There's more, the judge said, gesturing toward a stack of legal papers on his desk. Pardons for every man who rode with you. Full restoration of citizenship. Property returned to those I displaced in my pursuit. The federal government owes me favors, they'll honor the documents. Ezekiel studied the papers with eyes that had learned to read legal documents during his months as an outlaw. The pardons were comprehensive, covering not just their original crimes, but everything they'd done, since the bank robberies, the jailbreaks, the armed resistance to federal authority. Why? Evangeline asked. Why now, when you could have done this months ago? Her father's answer came in broken whispers. Because I realized that if I died with your blood on my hands, I'd face your mother and whatever comes next with nothing but shame. She loved you more than life itself, Evangeline. She'd never forgive me for destroying her daughter in the name of protecting her. Outside, dawn was breaking over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The sound of horses approached, but these weren't federal cavalry. Pike and the others were coming down from the hills, their long exile finally over. Will you forgive me? Judge Whitmore asked, his voice barely audible. Evangeline looked at her dying father, then at her husband, then at the diary that held her mother's blessing. The answer didn't come from anger or hurt, but from something deeper, the knowledge that forgiveness was the only force strong enough to break a cycle of vengeance that had consumed too many lives. I forgive you, Father, she said simply, but more importantly, you need to forgive yourself. The judge nodded, tears streaming down his wasted cheeks. Outside, their former enemies were laying down weapons and preparing to become neighbors again. While inside, a family began the slow work of healing wounds that had seemed mortal. But the story wasn't over. Dawn brought new challenges, new choices. That would test whether love truly could conquer the divisions that hate had carved so deep. Spring came early to the valley that year, as if the land itself was eager to heal from winter's wounds. By May, the abandoned farms were showing signs of life again, fields plowed and planted by families returning to homes they'd been forced to flee. Businesses reopening as trust slowly replaced fear. Ezekiel stood in the doorway of the old Whitmore mansion, now transformed into something unprecedented in the county's history, a school where former slaves sat beside poor whites, where the children of outlaws learned letters alongside the daughters of merchants. Evangeline had insisted on it, claiming her inheritance not in gold, but in the chance to reshape her father's legacy. The Pemberton boys stirring up trouble again, Pike reported, riding up from town with news that had become routine. Young Charles Pemberton, the same man Judge Whitmore had once suggested as a suitable husband, had been spreading talk about unnatural mixing and the need to restore proper order. Let him talk, Evangeline replied, emerging from the schoolhouse. With ink-stained fingers and a smile that had grown brighter each day since her father's peaceful death, 3 months prior. Talk is all he's got left. The transformation hadn't been without cost. Several prominent families had left the county entirely, unable to stomach the new reality where their former tracker and his judge's daughter held moral authority. The federal government had initially balked at honoring the deathbed pardons until pressure from reformers and growing public sympathy for the Millbrook lovers made resistance politically impossible. But perhaps the most profound change was in Ezekiel himself. The desperate fugitive had evolved into something rarer, leader who'd learned to channel rebellion into reconstruction. The skills that had made him a successful hunter now served to track down families driven from their homes and convince them to return. The courage that had made him an effective outlaw now drove him to stand before hostile town meetings and speak for those who had no voice. "Wedding gift," Friedrich Weber announced, approaching with a roughly carved wooden cradle. That made Evangeline gasp with delighted surprise. The old German's weathered face crinkled into a rare smile. "Little bird tells me congratulations are in order, Ja." Ezekiel's arm tightened around his wife's expanding waist, wonder and terror warring in his expression. Their child would be born into a world they'd helped reshape, but also one where enemies still lurked and old hatreds died hard. 3 generations, Evangeline murmured, her hand resting protectively over the life growing within her. "My mother chose love and died young. My father chose power and died bitter. Maybe our child will choose something better, like what?" Pike asked, genuinely curious. "Hope," she said simply. "The belief that people can change, that love really is stronger than fear." As if summoned by her words, a rider approached from the south, one of the network of former outlaws and sympathizers, who now carried news and mail throughout the territory. His message was brief but electrifying. Congress was debating a bill to grant homestead rights to freed slaves, and northern newspapers were calling Millbrook the valley where America found its conscience. That evening, as the extended family of former outlaws and returned refugees gathered for their weekly communal dinner, Reverend Stern offered a prayer that captured the moment's significance. "We thank you, Lord, for showing us that love doesn't ask permission, it simply is. That justice doesn't require vengeance, it requires mercy. And that home isn't a place you're born to, but a place you choose to build." Later, as Ezekiel and Evangeline walked alone by Miller's Creek where their story had begun, they could see lights in windows that had been dark for months, hear children's laughter echoing from houses that had stood empty, witness the slow miracle of a community healing itself. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd been more careful?" Evangeline asked, her head resting against her husband's shoulder. "If we'd courted properly, asked permission, followed all the rules?" Ezekiel considered the question seriously, his tracker's mind following that alternate path to its likely conclusion. "Your father would have refused permission. I'd have been run out of the valley or worse. You'd have married Pemberton or someone like him, lived a comfortable, empty life while good people suffered in silence, and the valley would still be under his thumb," she agreed. "The schools would still be segregated, the banks would still be foreclosing on farmers, and men like Pike would still be hiding in the mountains. So you don't regret it, any of it?" Her answer came with the certainty that had carried her through months of danger and exile. "I regret the pain, the deaths, the time we lost. But I don't regret choosing you, choosing us, choosing to fight for something better." Above them, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to human struggles but somehow blessed by human courage. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like earthbound constellations, each one representing a life touched by their rebellion, family given hope by their refusal to accept that love must bow to power. Their child kicked within Evangeline's womb. As if eager to join this world, they'd helped create a world where a judge's daughter and a poor tracker could stand as equals, where former enemies could become neighbors, where love truly had proven stronger than the laws that tried to contain it. The creek murmured its ancient song, carrying their whispered promises toward the distant Mississippi and the endless American possibility that lay beyond. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new chances to prove that the heart's fierce democracy could overcome any tyranny. But tonight, in the valley where two souls had dared to love without permission. Peace reigned supreme.